Does any senator wish to vote? Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 57, the nays are 39. And the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Kai Rachel Feldblum of the District of Columbia to be a member of the Equal Opportunity Commission for a term expiring July 1st, 2018.
Pursuant to the provisions of S-Res 15 of the 113th Congress, there will now be up to 8 hours of post-cloture consideration of the nomination, equally divided in the usual form.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Through the Chair, it's my understanding if I yielded back 40 minutes, the vote would occur at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
The Senator is correct.
I yield back 40 minutes. Of Democrats.
The time is so yielded.
Madam President.
The Senator from Arizona.
I rise to address nominations and some other issues. Madam President, let me say a few words about nominations. The Senate just confirmed President Obama's third nominee to the D.C. Circuit Court this year and did so without the support of a single senator from the minority party. I have only been in the Senate for a year, but I understand the importance of minority rights and the moderating effect that the minority has on the nominations and on legislation as a whole. Requiring the support of at least some of the minority senators encourages both the nomination and appointment of more mainstream nominees. I think in the case of executive nominees, it ensures the heads of executive agencies are responsible to both the minority and majority parties. Minority input reinforces the separation of powers and safeguards the ability of Congress to conduct effective oversight. Let me just give a couple of examples of where I think that this is important and something that we have lost once the nuclear option was employed with regard to executive appointments. Earlier this year, we had the appointment of a person to head the Environmental Protection Agency, extremely important agency, important to Arizona, particularly Arizona with a lot of federal lands, a lot of state lands, public lands in general, where actions of the federal government are perhaps amplified. And so that was an extremely important appointment. I ended up voting for Gina McCarthy. I think she is a good nominee. And I understand that the President won the election. He has the power to appoint his people and his team. And unless there are extraordinary circumstances, he ought to have that right. And I voted for most of his nominees, nearly all of them, in fact. And in this case, though, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, while she was the nominee, knew that she needed 60 votes. She knew that she ought to see not just the members of the majority party, but those in the minority as well. And she made the rounds to my office as well as others. And we had a good meeting. I explained to her the importance, for example, of the dust regulations that are promulgated by the EPA, where Arizona has a problem. We have occasional dust storms that aren't recognized as such. And sometimes we have to fill out paperwork that is costly and time-consuming just to convince the federal government that an occasional dust storm does blow through. It has nothing to do with air quality protections or provisions that have been put in place, but just because of the conditions on the ground. But the EPA's guidance and regulations just haven't caught up to that yet. She was understanding of that. She'd worked at the state level and agreed to talk to the stakeholders and interested parties in Arizona about this issue. She made good on that promise. We had that conference call a few weeks later, and it was the first time that many of these people in Arizona had been heard on the issue. They had a good meeting with the EPA, and it will, I think, lead to better regulations coming out of the EPA. That was a product of the process that we have here. that requires nominees from the President not just to go to the majority party, but to the minority party as well. I fear that that's been lost, and I think that that's a shame. I wish we could go back to the system that we had and the system that the Senate has operated on for a long, long time. When I gave my maiden speech here on this floor a few months ago, I mentioned that the party holding the gavel is on a short leash. Bringing even the most non-controversial resolutions to the Senate floor requires the agreement or at least the acquiescence of the minority party. I mentioned at that time that over the past decade, both parties have chafed under these arrangements. Both parties have at times considered changing the rules that would in some measure make the Senate more like the House. I mentioned at that time, up to that time, that both parties had resisted that urge, had been convinced by their own members and others that it wasn't the way to go. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. And I think this body, this institution, will be the poorer for it. And I hope that we can return to the traditions of the Senate, one where consensus is the hallmark of this body. I hope that we can get there. Let me turn my attention to one of the issues that I think is a good example of what happens when one party moves legislation through this body too quickly without consultations from the other party. And that has to do with the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act passed with not a single Republican vote in the House or in the Senate. And I think it's a good example of what can happen if legislation is rushed through without consultation or input from both parties. Let me just talk a little about some of the issues that have come up with the Affordable Care Act that are known as Obamacare. The Wall Street Journal had an op-ed the other day, or I'm sorry, an editorial that talked about some of the issues that are going on with the enrollment data. Said most of Washington seems to have bought the White House claim that 36 federal exchanges are finally working. They go on to explain what working really means. A charitable reading suggests that Obamacare's net enrollment stands for about -4 million. That's the estimated 4 to 5 million and a half people who have had their individual plans liquidated as Obamacare non-compliant. They were liquidated because they were non-compliant with Obamacare. That is offset by about 364,682 who've signed up for a plan on the state and federal exchange, and the 803,077 who have found to be eligible to receive Medicaid. So if you take that and net it out, it means that net enrollment, people who now are covered by insurance of some type, has gone down by about 4 million. I think that when you consider that things are picking up in terms of people signing up, but they're still being dropped far faster from private insurance plans than they're being picked up. It goes on, this editorial from the Wall Street Journal, saying HHS is boasting of enrollment for November that was 4 times as high as October, yet 62% of the total was in the state exchanges, some of which are marginally less prone to crashing than the federal version. Then again, 41 states posted sign-ups only in the 3- and 4-digit or figures, including 8 states that run their own exchanges. Oregon managed to scrape up just 44 people. Among the 137,204 federal sign-ups, no state is reaching the critical mass necessary for stable insurance prices. I think that one problem they mention as well is that these figures are probably misleading. Larger problem, they say, is that none of these represent true enrollments. HHS is reporting how many people, quote, selected a plan on the exchange, not how many people have actually enrolled in the plan with an insurance company by paying the first month's premium. That's how private insurance companies define enrollment. HHS has made up its own standard. I think when we find out that there's probably a pretty large drop-off between those who actually enroll and those who actually sign up, then we'll realize that these figures are misleading as well. Let me turn to another issue, a related issue on this. Michael Tanner of the Cato Institute had a piece the other day where he says the good news is, if you want to call it that, is that roughly 1.6 million Americans have enrolled in Obamacare so far. The not so good news is that 1.46 million of them actually signed up for Medicaid. If the trend continues, it could bankrupt both federal and state governments. He notes that Medicaid is already America's third largest government program, trailing only Social Security and Medicare as a proportion of the federal budget. Almost 8 cents of every dollar that the federal government spends goes to Medicaid. That's more than $265 billion a year. As these Medicaid rolls expand, we know that that's going to be a huge expense and probably a greater number of people signing up than anybody thought would do. The federal government has committed to pick up 100% of the cost of new enrollees for a 3-year period and then 90% thereafter. If the federal government makes good on that pledge, it may cost us a lot more than we figured, and it'll increase the budget pressure on the federal government. If the federal government does what it often does and shifts those costs to the states, then the states are going to need to be prepared for a big increase as well. He mentions state governments pay another $160 billion for Medicaid today. For most states, Medicaid is the single largest cost of government, crowding out education, transportation, and everything else. New York spent more than $15 billion on Medicaid last year, roughly 30% of all state expenditures. The Kaiser Foundation projects that just over the next 10 years, New York taxpayers will shell out some $433 billion for the program. There are going to be increasing pressures on state budgets as well. So these are some of the things that we haven't considered yet. As we go into the new year, the next big shoe to drop will be in April or so, when insurance companies actually see who is enrolling and who is not in the exchanges. I think everyone's fear is that there are too few healthy 28-year-olds signing up and more who are more high-cost enrollees. And the numbers just won't add up, and insurance companies will be forced to jack up their rates, which will make insurance even less affordable than it is today and could increase the pressures that we're talking about here, both on the federal government, on state governments, and most importantly, on families across the country. I found of interest today a story by CNN. CNN went and looked at 4 stories after the Obamacare so-called fix. They concluded that, in their headline, many are still left out. Let me just go over a couple of these, and it gives some idea of what families are facing. And let me just say, this mirrored, it's exactly what I'm hearing at home from neighbors and family and friends, and exactly what I'm experiencing enrolling in the federal exchange as well, these kind of cost increases. It reads, in the face of mounting criticism, President Barack Obama announced last month that he would allow insurance companies to renew so-called subpar plans for existing consumers. But nearly a month later, not everyone has seen the benefit of the policy change. They note that they spoke to 4 people in the days and weeks that followed the President's announcement to see how they've been affected. The results were varied, and for some of them, the future remains uncertain. When you read through the stories, it seems for everyone it's a pretty uncertain and more costly future. They take one, the first person that they talked to, a woman by the name of Catherine. She said it's a 280% increase in premiums for her family. It was in September when Catherine received her letter. The much-maligned healthcare.gov website had yet to be launched, and the approval ratings for the President's signature health care law were on the upswing. Catherine knew that she would have to sign up for a new insurance plan, but didn't expect her options to be so costly. She's a mom and a Navy veteran, employed part-time as a nurse. Her husband, a small business owner. The employer, her employer offers insurance plans, but because she was not working full-time, getting a policy to cover her family of 3 was expensive. Unfortunately for her, a provision in the new health care law states that since her company offers plans that she could afford to cover herself, but not her family, she does not qualify for a subsidy from the federal government, even though she's below the income threshold. She's therefore subject to a universal, unusual loophole that requires her to pay the full premium on the new policy if she wants to cover her family or leave her job to get the subsidy. So you're seeing here a huge increase in premiums, 280% increase in premiums. That mirrors what I've been hearing from others as well. Just down the street from me at home, Greg and Linda live. I got an email from Greg, a friend of ours, the other day. He said that he and Linda, who are near 60 years old, had their insurance canceled because it was non-compliant with the new law. They went out and shopped on the exchange and found that the cheapest policy, or the policy that most closely mirrored theirs, actually not as good as theirs, but most closely mirrored theirs, was double the price, more than $800 a month. That's what I'm hearing again and again and again. When you read through these stories, you see it again and again and again here. Here's another one. By most people's standards, Valentina is in excellent health. This is from the CNN story again. She works out 6 to 7 days a week, competes in triathlons with a group of equally high-energy friends, participated in 10 to 12 races this year. She is a moderate Democrat who hoped that this new law would help people with pre-existing conditions, such as her husband, get access to insurance and would allow people who could not afford insurance to get plans within her reach. It goes on to say that she had a plan, but then everything changed in October. She was notified by her insurer that her plan could not be renewed for 2014. The comparable plan offered was a 29% increase in premiums with higher copays as well as significantly higher prescription costs. Now, people I talk to, virtually all of them will say not only is there an increase in premiums, but there are higher copays, higher max out-of-pocket costs. It's just not as affordable as it was before. And I think the fear that all of us have as we go into the new year and we see the numbers of those who are actually signing up or not signing up, it simply means that rates are going to go up again and again. Once the employer mandate kicks in, and a lot of businesses then unload their employees into the exchange, you're simply going to see the same problem. Only those who can afford or those who are more expensive to insure will be signing up. By and large, too few healthy individuals to lower the cost for everyone in a high pool will enroll, and so costs will simply go up again. We can't have this go on, Mr. President, for very much longer. This is called the Affordable Care Act, but I think most of us are finding that it's anything but. Let me just go to one more of these stories while I have time. This is a Connecticut psychologist by the name of Martin. Plenty of experiences dealing with insurance companies. He's been practicing in the state for 11 years, runs 2 offices. They sent a letter, Blue Cross Blue Shield sent a letter notifying him that his plan would no longer be offered for renewal when it expires in January. They said that he needed to shop on the exchange. He goes on to explain it's simply not as affordable as his old plan. Mr. President, we have got to, as we go along in this coming year, find out how we can actually make good on the promise that was given to have health care that is actually accessible and affordable for those who can't access it now. We all know that the current system doesn't work very well. It needs to be changed, but changed in this manner simply means that more people are uninsured and are unsure about their future as well. I appreciate this opportunity to be here and speak about this tonight, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Wyoming. In Wyoming, it's midnight right now, and I suspect with their shift work that there are people watching and probably wondering what the heck's going on. We're here at this hour dealing with a non-essential distraction, and it's being done so that it's a distraction from the mounting Obamacare problems. None of these nominees need to be confirmed. Not the circuit court judges, maybe especially the circuit court judges. I was here when President Bush tried to fill those circuit court judges in the D.C. Circuit. And I remember Senators Reid and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee making an impassioned speech that they weren't needed, that the workload was too low in the District of Columbia, that they should not be approved. And of course, since they were in the majority, they had the capability to ever keep that from happening. But when the shoe's on the other foot, they need those D.C. court judges, even though the caseload has not gone up. So they broke the rules to change the rules, and part of that was so that, we're calling it Obamacare 2. It was so that the American people would be distracted from the problems that they're having signing up for Obamacare. Some of my constituents asked that I not call it Obamacare. They asked that I call it the Obama tax, because that's what the Supreme Court said was the legal part of it, that we can virtually tax anybody, anything we want, as long as we call it a tax. If we put it in the Commerce Clause, oh, that won't work. But that's the ruling that we got from the Supreme Court. So, right now, the Democrats are trying to distract us from what's going on across this country. And oh boy, is it going on across this country. So we should be dealing with the problems of Obamacare so that each day the health care law is going to fail to live up to the promises made by the administration. How many people have heard the president say, and he started doing this clear back in the joint sessions of Congress so that he could explain his law, he said, if you like the insurance you got, you can keep it. That hasn't been true almost since day one. It especially has not been true since some of the regulations have been put in place. So we have a failed law. Let me tell you how bad it's failing. A couple of weekends ago, I got to Cheyenne, Wyoming early enough to address some school kids. I actually read a children's book to kindergarten classes of a whole school. And after I finished, a little girl came up. She couldn't have been any taller than that. And she said, are we going to be able to fix this health care mess? Now, if it's gotten down to kindergartners, you know that the adults are talking about it even more. It is a problem. It's a problem that needs to be solved. We shouldn't be playing the Grinch that stole Christmas and doing a whole bunch of non-essential appointments that could well wait till after Christmas or next year without hurting the courts at all. But again, they want this outcry. They want this to detract from what's happening with Obamacare. Millions of people have lost their health care plans that they were told they could keep. And of course, the president's been forced now to admit that he broke his promise, but he didn't remove the promise from the White House health care website. A week ago, it still said, if you like your plan, you can keep it and you don't have to do a thing. Well, I guess that might be partly true, because he announced a new initiative that he said would really allow people to keep their existing health insurance plans this time. He should have added, if he wanted to be honest, for a short time, because that's all he gave them. And that isn't even true, because one thing he doesn't have the power under the Constitution to do is to rewrite or ignore the laws. We passed a law by this body and the House, and he signed it, and he continually talks about how that's settled law, and you can't change it. And then about twice a week, he changes it without authority, ignoring the written laws passed by Congress. So it would also mean that he'd have to be willing to ignore a 2010 administration regulation that's prevented insurers from continuing to offer insurance for millions of individuals and small business. That's right. At the same time, the president was promising out of one side of his mouth that people could keep their health insurance, the other side was approving rules that would make that impossible. And everyone who was in the Senate at the time knew it. It was right there in the Federal Register. And it was written by the president's own administration. Congress knew and the administration knew the president was not telling the truth. But he kept making the promise anyway. When one party has 60 votes in the Senate, the minority party has very limited things that it can do. There are a few exceptions to the majority leader's control. But essentially he decides what the Senate can debate and vote on. And I've noticed that if an amendment comes up that he doesn't like, instead of having us vote on it, he pulls the bill down. Now, that's not the way that it used to be. We used to be able to put amendments in, and even if the majority didn't like the amendment, we still had to vote on it. Of course, if they didn't like it, they voted it down. But that doesn't happen anymore. A number of bills that we've done around here have been prevented from having amendments. And sometimes this negotiation process that the leader uses takes 2 or 3 weeks. The amendments could be voted on in a week if they were just allowed to be voted on. But this process of negotiating so that he can tell the minority what amendments he's willing to address of ours, that takes away the right for us to represent our constituents. Problems are different in the West. Problems are different in Wyoming. Problems are different in big cities. You can't have one size fits all that works for everything. The reason there are so many members of the Senate and so many members of the House is so that the unintended consequences might be found before a bill becomes law. That hasn't been the case around here. That definitely was not the case on Obamacare. So the leader has helped the majority to prevent us from being able to bring up any amendments on any number of topics, and that's led to what we're doing tonight. We're taking advantage of some of our rights as the minority to see if we are going to get a chance at all. Nobody ever expected one party to be able to dictate to the other party. Of course, the other side did have 60 votes, and when you've got 60 votes, you can do anything you want, because there's no such thing as a filibuster if you can get all 60 votes. Of course, you'll probably remember that the majority had to kind of buy some of those votes. Yeah, there was the Nebraska Cornhusker kickback, and that senator decided not to run again. And there's been the Louisiana purchase, and that senator is up for election. And there was the Florida deal and the New York deal that dealt with Medicare Advantage. Now, none of the rest of the states got those deals. And they had to be done. Those are places where there are a lot of seniors, and it was going to take away some of their capability for health care insurance that they already had. In fact, the bill stole $716 billion from Medicare, and Medicare was going broke. And it did it to make new programs. It didn't do it to fix Medicare. Now, tomorrow in the Finance Committee, we're going to be marking up a doc fix, a thing so that doctors will be paid adequately, because there was a provision there that would continually reduce the amount that they're getting. And, of course, as you reduce the amount that a doctor can get, even in times of inflation, pretty quick the doctors can't afford to run their practice. And when they can't run their practice, they don't see Medicare patients. And, in fact, some practices shut down. Others sell out to the hospital. Now, do you think it's cheaper to get health care from a doctor or health care from a hospital? That drives up the cost again. So one sure way to inject something not approved by the majority leader is to find an offensive regulation and petition the Senate for a debate and a simple majority vote. We have this thing called the Congressional Review Act, and that's exactly how it works. But you got to keep your eye on the Federal Register. And because that's where the administration reports what the effects are going to be and what the actual regulations are. And sometimes the regulations have more of an impact than the law itself. And that was the case in this instance. Again, it dealt with this: if you like your health insurance, you can keep it. But there was a regulation that came out in 2010 that took away that right. Yes, I'm the accountant. I read the bills. And now I even have to admit that I read the Federal Register. But there are a lot of dollars that are mentioned in there. And some of those are consequences of the bill. And if you can catch one of those regulations within 60 days of the regulation's publication, and you get enough people to sign a petition, you are guaranteed 8 hours of debate and an up or down vote. And if you miss that date, it can't be brought up again. And once it's been brought up, it can't be brought up again. And so if you lose the vote or you lose the opportunity, it can't be brought up again. That opportunity is gone. And that's an opportunity the Democrats in the Senate squandered. Every single one voted to defeat my resolution, and many ridiculed the effort. Over the next few months, their constituents are going to make them answer for this. And I can tell that some of them are already antsy over it, that they're already drafting bills. And, of course, when you draft a bill in the context of a crisis, there's this the legislative rule. That's if it's worth reacting to, it's worth overreacting to. So once again, it isn't something that will be brought through the correct process and ironed out so that there aren't unintended consequences. And they'll have to pay a price. They need to pay attention when there's a rule that's going to affect people adversely. And I have heard their arguments. There were a number of issues in this regulation, and there were two that they thought were good. Two that they thought were good. Now, there isn't any reason they couldn't have voted for the thing, gotten rid of it, and then brought those two back. That's how it ought to work. I really think that Congress ought to have the right to review every major regulation. And if we don't have a majority vote for that regulation, it should never go into effect. Now, a lot of the regulations are written by the administration, but the direction for doing the regulation comes from Congress. It's to get into a level of detail that we don't handle here, but maybe we should. Maybe that ought to be our biggest job, to make sure that the regulations are what we want to have happen, and to be sure that the unintended consequences aren't even in the regulation. But we've kind of given that away, but now we need to be sure we take back some oversight over that. Otherwise, you've got an administration that's a runaway, and that's the situation that we have right now. So I've fought against the new health care law for the past 4 years because I knew there was no way the president could keep all of the promises he was making about how the law would affect the average Americans. As an accountant and a former small business owner, I understood that you can't mandate that everyone must purchase gold-plated health insurance plans without increasing costs and causing millions of people to lose their existing insurance plans. In fact, I've talked about exchanges, and the exchange that's there is not the one that I envisioned at all. I didn't expect that the federal government was going to say, well, there are only 4 kinds of plans you can buy. You can pick it out from bronze to platinum. But if you don't pick out one of our 4 plans, you can't have a plan. We did prescription Part D, and at that time there were only 2 companies that were providing seniors with prescription drugs in Wyoming. I was a little worried about what was going to happen if we opened the market a little bit. I was hopeful that it would cause more competition, and that's exactly what happened. Instead of 2 companies providing the pharmaceuticals, 48 of them were interested in doing it. Now, that created a little confusion, but there was an exchange that you could go into, and you could list the drugs that you were taking. And when you hit the button, it said, these are the companies that can provide that drug, and this is the price that you'll have to pay. Pardon me. Before that went into effect, it saved seniors 25%. That's what competition does. That's how the insurance plan should be set up. I've had a 10-step bill since before the president became a senator that suggested how we could provide insurance for everyone. Now, another thing that kind of fascinates me is the president talks about how we eliminated the caps for chronic illnesses so that nobody has to lose their insurance or lose their pay just because they have a chronic illness. You know what the flaw in that one is? If you're in Medicare, there are still caps. If you're a senior, there are still caps. We didn't remove those. So even that's not a completely true statement. So there's a little bit more here. If you can't keep the health plans you like, then you're going to have a tougher time keeping the doctors and the hospitals you like. And we're hearing those stories all over the nation right now. Of course, the biggest problem, and the one that this little kindergartner was raising, is getting on the website to even be able to sign up for one of these policies that has more in it than what a family might want, particularly what an individual might want. And we've had a lot of discussion on that. But that website's just the tip of the iceberg. That's what we've seen so far, the website failures. And I think a lot of people have noticed that there are some website failures out there. In fact, I remember Jay Leno saying you got to watch these healthcare sites because there are 700 sites already that are trying to steal your personal information, steal your identity. But he did point out that there's one way to know if you're on one of those phony sites. If you're able to sign up, you're on a phony site. So yes, there have been website failures, but here's what's coming yet. Higher premiums, canceled coverages. You can't keep your doctor. If you can't see your doctor, do you have any insurance at all? I don't think so. And then the fraud and identity theft that I mentioned, and higher copays and deductibles. Pretty universal. There might be a few examples out there of where this has benefited somebody, but most of the people are now paying through the nose and finding out that it's very hard for them to be able to afford the insurance that they want. So we should get ready for the next wave of disappointment and frustration by the expectations created by this president and his public relations machine as they come crashing up against the harsh reality of the real world. Obamacare casualties will continue to grow even as the president launches media blitz after media blitz, and those cost some money, incidentally, in an attempt to convince people that higher premiums, worse coverage, and a bigger debt for this country is a good thing. Now, one of the things that we were able to get in the bill was a requirement that the Senate and the House had to come under the same rules as everybody else when it came to exchanges. That's created quite a bit of consternation around here. In the committees, it's improved things. I remember about 4 months ago in the Finance Committee, we were having a hearing with the people doing this website that has all the failures. And we were asking, both sides were asking intense questions because we wanted to be sure this thing would work. And one of the questions was, you know, how's it coming? And they said, oh, it's fine. We've already beta tested it. It will work. When it comes to October 1st, everything will work. Well, I remember Senator Baucus saying, could we get a list of the people that beta tested it? To my knowledge, he's never gotten that list because what we found out since is it hadn't been tested yet at that time. See, would that be considered a lie? Not sure that all the hearings are under oath. Maybe they ought to be. But at any rate, it wasn't ready. As it turned out, there was 26 hours of beta testing. Talking to some of the other companies that would have liked to, that tried to bid on that and bid for a final project instead of bidding for a cost-plus job. That's what we got, was a cost-plus job. So any way that they complicate it makes it more expensive, makes them earn more money. But talking to some of those other companies, they said that that should have been beta tested for at least 6 weeks to 6 months. And not only that, they should have had professional hackers trying to get into that system to see what's happening. Now, we keep having hearings on this, and I remember at one of them, Secretary Sebelius was there, and we were asking about the security of the information. And I'm still trying to figure this out. She said that the information goes in there and it pings around to the different people that need it, but none of it is stored in the system. And everybody's saying, so how do you retrieve your record? Well, I guess that's a problem that some of the Americans are having. They put that information in there, they try to retrieve the record, they can't get the record. So it's a system that's fraught with a lot of problems and should never have happened, but I guess that's what happens when you get in a hurry and you aren't ready for it, and you're more interested in public relations and media blitzes than you are in getting it right. I know the President went coast to coast and all over the place, and he sent other people to try and convince people that higher premiums and worse coverage and a bigger debt for this country is a good thing. Oh yeah, that's another interesting thing at our hearing. We were asked, they said that the premiums came down. And so there were some extensive questions about that because there weren't very many people that were aware of any of it coming down. And the explanation was that the administration's estimate was that that the prices would go up by 68%, and they only went up by 45%. So that was a reduction in rates. No, that was an increase in rates. And you can't fool the American people that way. A lot of this is a smoke and mirrors attempt, and it's not working. So what's the opposition doing? We're doing a bunch of judges that don't need to be approved, and that's to take the attention off of Obamacare. But we're not going to let that happen. The American public deserves to know what's happening with Obamacare. The American public is concerned about it. When you got kindergartners concerned about it, you got a lot of people concerned about it. In fact, we did a cookie party at our office today. My wife bakes a couple thousand cookies every year, and it's for the people that do the real work around the Senate. It's for the janitors and the carpenters and the electricians and the plumbers and the guards and the people that work in the restaurants. And they all come by. And I was surprised at how many of them were concerned about what's happening with their insurance and their ability to get on it. And some of them even recognized the effort that I made in 2010 to get the Congressional Review Act, that only window that we had to reverse that lie that if you like your insurance, you can keep it. So during the health care debate, the President and his congressional allies also promised that the new health care law would reduce health insurance premiums for American families. And I just covered that briefly, but I and my colleagues argued that rather than saving money, the new law instead would drive up the costs of insurance for millions of families. There's no way in there to increase the competition. If you're going to increase the competition, you need to have the sale of insurance across state lines. You need to have people be able to go through an association to get a big enough group that they can effectively negotiate with an insurance company. There are a lot of ways of getting that to increase, and that didn't happen. So essentially there were also some co-ops that were formed. And now it looks like the money that went to the co-ops may have been money poured down the drain, because apparently they're not doing too well. So disastrous planning and implementation of the healthcare.gov website made it difficult for Americans to learn just how much this partisan law has driven up costs. And we warned when it was the 60 votes that could pass the whole thing, that if the 60 votes passed the whole thing without a single Republican vote, that they would be stuck with it. And that's exactly where the majority is at the present time, stuck with it. So people are learning how much their premiums are increasing, and the more they do, the more people will not appreciate how the President's promise failed to reflect the reality of the new health care law. I think they really thought they might get to just kind of pick what they needed and find out what the cost was. That was my idea for how we ought to do it. I presented that at the summit with the President. He invited several of us after the bill passed. He should have done it before the bill passed, but he did it after the bill passed. A dozen of us and a dozen Democrats got invited to the Blair House to tell him what we thought should be in the bill. And the strange thing about that was every time that a Republican threw out an idea, he just chopped it to bits. He didn't comment on the Democrat ones. At the end of the day, he gave a speech that he'd obviously written the day before, because it didn't deal with any of the ideas that we'd discussed on either side of the aisle. And he obviously rejected every one of the Republican ideas. I talked about exchanges at that and said you should be able to go online, have a list of insurance possibilities, and you could check whatever possibility you thought you needed. One of the things they talk about is if you're a 60-year-old lady that's had a hysterectomy, you probably don't need maternity care. So you wouldn't check that box. But you'd check the boxes that you thought applied, that you'd really like to have, And then when you hit the enter key, it would bring up the list of the companies that would provide exactly what you wanted and tell you what the cost would be. You wouldn't have to sit down with a dozen or 24 insurance agents and hear their pitch for why they're the best. You'd be able to tell what you wanted, and then you'd be able to see who provided it and what it would cost. And then you'd have choices. And that would inspire competition, partly because each of the companies would know what the other companies were selling things for. And that sometimes brings prices down as well. So we had disastrous planning and implementation, and people are starting to learn how much their premiums are increasing. The President and his allies also promised that the new law would improve the economy and protect Medicare beneficiaries. I've always been wondering how that would work. We now know that the small businesses across the country are not hiring workers because of the impact of the health care law and the impact that it'll have on their bottom lines. I'm traveling in Wyoming, and I run into a guy who says, you know, I've got this great business, and it's time for me to expand, and in this town I want to go to, there's a phenomenal location. It's the perfect location, and the price is right. Should I expand? One of the questions that I ask is, how many employees do you have? And if he says 45 or 50, say, I'd take another look at it, because you better see the effect that Obamacare is going to have on what you're trying to do. And in most of those instances, they have not increased. And there are a number of problems that way. I was in the Small Business Committee hearing, and I was kind of wondering what aggregation meant. That's a pretty big word to use in there. But they were able to explain aggregation. And aggregation means that this rule that if you're under 30 hours, you're considered part-time. So we changed it from being under 40 hours to being under 30 hours before it was part-time. And that's caused a lot of people to take 2 jobs and not get benefits with either of the jobs. So they're getting a reduction in pay because of this law. But here's the kicker. That doesn't help the small businessman anyway. Here's how aggregation works. You got 10 employees at 29 hours. That's 290 hours. You divide by 30. And you find out that you still have 9 2/3 employees. So by making this drastic cut, you were only able to reduce your numbers by 1/3 of an employee. Again, that's kind of a fraudulent situation to rope people into doing the Obamacare thing. Now, another way that aggregation works, according to this hearing that I went to, is that if you own a piece of one business and you own a piece of the other business, but you don't own a majority of either of the businesses, the two have to be combined to figure out whether you got employees that have to come under Obamacare or not. That's wrong. That's fraud. These things ought to be real clear. And I think that if we ever were able to get a vote on raising that part-time work back up to 40 hours, I think you'd see a huge number of people that would vote for it, or a huge number of people that wouldn't be around here much longer. And, of course, the Small Business Administration says that a small business isn't 50 employees. A small business is 500 employees. So just by changing those 2 things in Obamacare, we could probably have more jobs in the economy than the stimulus package ever provided. There are other changes we could make in Obamacare that would have a bigger effect than the stimulus package. Oh, yes, that's right. That's not a very high mountain to climb, is it? The thing we ought to do is eliminate some of the regulations that have been put out there. I know of 6 regulations that if we got rid of them, it wouldn't affect our way of life, but it would increase jobs in the economy more than the stimulus. We could have an increase in the economy around here, but we can't do it if we keep loading up the businesses with more regulation. You know, we had a government shutdown not too long ago, and I got an interesting letter from a trucker from Pinedale, Wyoming. He said he was getting a little tired of all the people that were riding in the wagon and how many fewer people were pulling the wagon. And what he's referring to with that is every time we expand the government, every time we do one of these new programs and put a whole bunch more people on the payroll, Heck, we got a whole bunch more just in IRS people that are supposed to be checking on Obamacare. If you put them in the wagon and the private sector has to pull it, there is a point where they can't pull it anymore. And what he was suggesting was that if we wanted to really find out about America, that the private sector ought to have a shutdown. And it wouldn't take 16 days for us to realize the effect of the private market. And that's something we've got to watch out for, because that is where the taxes come from. Oh yes, all of us in government pay taxes. None of us pay as much taxes as we receive in wages. So we're riding in the wagon, and it's getting tougher and tougher to pull. And Obamacare is one of the things that really loaded the wagon up. Heck, it just with the regulations that they have to pull around, it's a tremendous, tremendous burden. A small businessman can't read the thousands of pages of regulations that come out. But you know what? They have to. I was able to get a review committee if there's over $1 million in cost to new regulations. And that's a pretty severe committee. They really do a good job. I'm pleased with the people that are on it. Unfortunately, again, we're missing an enforcement piece to that, so that, again, the regulation disappears for small businessmen if it's going to be really detrimental. We try to do these one-size-fits-all things around here. That's what Obamacare is. Well, it's 4 sizes fit all. But one size fits all or 4 sizes fit all won't take care of America. This is the most diverse country probably in the whole world, and the most successful country in the whole world because it's so diverse. Because we have so many different kinds of people doing so many different things. And it's also been one of the most innovative countries in the whole world. And that's where we want to be. We want to be inventing the new things for the world and having the other countries pick them up when they get a little older and steal them at that point. That's the way that it's always worked. But we're taking away the incentives for these people to use their minds to create new things that will sell all over the world the way that we're used to it. That's what's brought the prosperity of the United States. Inventiveness. We invented a new government, and it's worked pretty good up to now. And we've invented all kinds of things that the world has benefited from. We need to make sure that what we do encourages that instead of discourages it. This thing that the government knows best, I just don't run into many people that think that's right. Most of them think that the government doesn't have enough experience in business. I go back to Wyoming almost every weekend, and I travel a different part of the state all the time. And over the weekend, I try to get into a business or two. I try to find out what it is they do, how they do it, and most importantly, how the federal government might interfere or help them. And it's very valuable. I have found that if a person hasn't been in business, that every business looks simple. And you can take a look at how people look at our job. It looks pretty simple. They don't expect that anybody's going to be speaking at 2:30 in the morning. They think that all we do is vote, which is not true. You have to draft bills. But it's more difficult in the private sector than it is in government, because people's wages, people's food, people's housing rely on that business paying them. I'm on the Small Business Committee, and I keep explaining that you really haven't been in business unless you've had that wake straight up in the middle of the night in a sweat saying, tomorrow is payday. How do I meet the payroll? That's being in business. And it happens to every small businessman out there once in a while. Some of them, it's the end of that small business. But we got to watch out for those small businesses, because those are the ones that grow into big businesses. Those are the ones that become a part of the world market. And there's more opportunity for that now than there ever was. But there isn't if we keep stifling them. If we keep piling regulations on so all the time they have is to read the regulations that we did. Thousands of pages of regulations are turned out here all the time. I know I read the Federal Register, and it's getting heavier to carry all the time. So we know that small businesses across the country are not hiring new workers because of the impact of the health care law and what it'll have on their bottom lines. You know, if they're not profitable, they're out of business. They're not like the government. They can't spend more money than they have. And they don't understand why we don't understand that. You know, why do we keep spending more money than we have coming in and doing it continually and continually? I guess it's because we can sell bonds and we don't think there's going to be any consequence to it. I can tell you that if interest rates go up, we're not going to be able to do even national defense. So we need to be a little more careful on what we're doing there and doing things more timely. So millions of Medicare beneficiaries are going to face reductions in their existing benefits as a result of the billions that were taken from Medicare, and that was to fund the new law. It wasn't to provide more benefits for seniors, and most of the seniors have figured that out. I already mentioned that they have caps on their benefits, even though the President promised there wouldn't be caps on benefits, and there aren't caps on benefits if you're out there working in the private sector, which incidentally makes it very hard to figure out the actuarial cost of a plan. So it's, excuse me, it's not quite 2014 yet, and most of the thousands of pages of the new law haven't even gone into effect. But each day, it seems, there's a new breaking story about what this debacle health care law is turning out to be. I got a letter from Jessica in Laramie who explains how this health care law is negatively affecting her. Jessica's catastrophic health care plan as a single adult, according to healthcare.gov, is $297 per month. This is with the premium support from the federal government. I repeat, this is with the subsidy. Now, the University of Wyoming health insurance rate for a semester is $452. That's over the course of 4 months. The university's rate is nothing new. It's been available for students long before the Democrats forced their health care disaster through Congress. Today, Jessica's premiums would cost more than any of her medical bills to date. Jessica recently fractured her foot, a very common injury, and this cost her less than $300 in medical bills. Now, when they get to looking on the website here, they're going to find out that the deductibles have gone up dramatically. And one of the things that's been constrained and in some cases eliminated is health savings accounts. That's the right thing for the young people to have. Of course, that doesn't pay for the older, sicker people, so we had to force them out of that system and get them into the regular system with everybody else and compress the prices so that the younger people are paying for the older people. I don't think they're going to stand for that very long. I think they're going to be upset about it. I think they are already upset about it. Health savings accounts provided them for a way to have catastrophic insurance and the right to put money tax-free into an account that could grow over time and provide for that deductible that they have. That's pretty essential. You know, and if they keep putting money in there, tax-free, and it keeps growing, it might take care of health care for the rest of their life. I think it's a solution actually for everybody. Again, it's one of those where one size doesn't fit all, but it fits a lot of people, and they ought to have that option, but they don't. Of course, the bill doesn't really allow us to do the flex spending accounts either. That's one where some people have the right through their company's health insurance plan to set aside some additional money to take care of health care during the year, again, tax-free. And, of course, since it's tax-free, we want to raise taxes, so we want to eliminate that. Well, I don't want to. I think that was an essential thing, and we ought to have it. But that side of the aisle decided it was a terrible thing, and we ought to eliminate it or reduce it and put extra requirements on it so there were less that you could get with it, even though those are individual choices on health care expenditures that the person has to make with what's their own money. That's one of the keys to bringing down health care expenditures. Have people make their own choices from their own money. If you're making it with the company's money or you're making it with the federal government's money, it doesn't make nearly as much difference. If you're not participating in a plan at all and you can go in and get whatever you need and you can go to a really expensive place instead of a less expensive place, that's going to break the system. And that's some of where we are. I mentioned Jessica, her plan, and how it's going to go up considerably, considerably higher than what her costs are in normal medical. Well, Jessica's mother also works for the state government, and she has a health care through the state. However, even though she's under the age of 26, Jessica is not allowed to join her mother's insurance plan. This is yet another example of a broken promise from the Obama administration. The president's flawed health care bill is a raw deal for our students and for our nation. Jessica said it, and I quote, "It feels like the government is punishing everyone for the few people who have health care bills worth more than a house. It isn't remotely fair." Yes. So students are paying the price, and they're realizing it, and they know what a bad deal was foisted on them. Karen from Cody contacted me because her construction company had to drop their Blue Cross Blue Shield health insurance plan. Why is this? The president's flawed health care plan mandates health care coverage for full-time employees that work more than 90 days for the company. The company was already providing health care plans for their employees, and now these folks can't keep their health care plan they liked. Their employees are mostly young Americans, and they're trying to make their budgets work. They couldn't afford to sign up for health care plans that would reduce their pay. As a result, all of her employees will have to seek individual policies in 2014. Karen also said there's a lack of information on insurance plans. She doesn't know what doctors and what medical facilities will be included or even available in any health insurance plan next year. Karen's upset. I'm upset too. I've said for 5 or 6 years that if you can't see a doctor, you don't have any kind of insurance. And that's what we're running into. Doctors are changing the way that they operate, and they're saying, let's see, you're in Medicare, I don't think I'll be able to take you. And we have some problems with doctors that deliver babies because of the long tail on their potential liability, which goes until the child is of age. That creates a lot of costs, but that's a whole other story. It is time for Congress to heed the calls of the majority of Americans and repeal this partisan law. But that isn't going to happen unless ordinary Americans continue to speak out and demand those who brought them Obamacare keep their promises, every one of them. Well, I could go on about health care a lot more, and I may come back to it, but I want to talk a little bit about the budget deal because I'm a little upset about that. One of the problems we've got around here is we're now into a mode of making deals instead of legislating. This body isn't designed to make deals, to send half a dozen people off to solve a problem, or in the case of the budget deal, 2 people, one from the House and one from the Senate. Everybody else feels like they ought to have some input for it. No, everybody feels that their constituents should have some input for it. And that's what we're missing. When we send off 2 people or 6 people or 10 people to come up with a deal and we set a date that the media can crescendo up to that point, and then they bring us this thing like the budget deal is going to be, and we get to vote yes or no. We don't get to do any amendments. That's not how we're designed, and that won't work either. So I want to talk about the recently announced Murray-Ryan budget deal. I'd hoped we'd have an open process to finally come up with a solution to our nation's spending problems, but that didn't happen. Instead, we have another backroom deal put together by 2 members. That's bad for our country. It's tough on those individuals. They worked hard. They came up with something, but they didn't have all of the input from everybody. And that makes it difficult, too. And that's usually done through amendments that are debated and voted up or down, but that doesn't happen around here anymore. This budget deal increases spending and shows that one thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is putting off the tough decisions. We can't keep on doing that. I just showed you how we're piling it on to the young people with Obamacare. Now we're piling it on to them with a budget deal. Every one of those man, woman, and child out there, some child that's just born today, already owes $50,000 in national debt. I'd like to carry that burden around and then be looking at student loans. Incidentally, student loans were a part of paying for Obamacare. You probably heard the controversy where the rates were to go to 6.88%, And at that time, the federal government was paying 0.86% for its interest. So that other 6% was supposed to go to help fund Obamacare. But the kids found out. They said, that's not fair. And so the president said, yeah, that's not fair. We're going to change that. We're going to knock it down to 3.44%. Well, that's still 3% that the kids are paying on Obamacare. But the real kicker is that it was just extended for 1 year, and it was just extended for 40% of the kids going to college. That's wrong. So when it came up the next time, several of us got together and did a bill, and that bill makes it a little bit more fair for 100% of the kids going to college. We set it as a slight fee above whatever the federal government's borrowing their money at. And what that fee is when you enter into that loan will be the price of that loan for the life of the loan. And it will apply for 100% of the individuals. So we found a way, and it actually passed. I think everybody was relieved, although we have this habit around here of wanting to hold people hostage 6 months at a time. That's what we've been doing on the doc fix for quite a while. But to get back to the budget deal, the plan does spend more than the current law. It charges people and states for more things and uses the money to increase the spending in non-related areas. Spending cuts are scheduled for outlying years. Yeah, we say, oh yeah, we're going to cut that stuff, but we're going to do it on the end of 10 years. And the so-called savings from that are used up right now. Now, is there anybody in America that can go ahead and spend their future earnings now and not have to do it on the other end then when it actually comes due? That's what we've been doing for far too long. Those spending cuts that are scheduled for outlying years, and they're called savings, they're used up right away. That just isn't real. We have to call it what it is. It's not real and it's wrong. This bill has a lot of problems. It again raises rates for premiums that private companies pay the federal government to guarantee their pension benefits. I worked on a bill, the Pension Protection Act, several years ago, and the goal of that bill was to make sure that companies that promised people pensions would result in people getting pensions, and we wanted to do it without putting the companies out of business, because then it falls on the federal government with this Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. Well, 2 years ago, we raised the rates, and the PBGC could use the money, but that isn't where the money went. We put it into highways for 2 years. 10 years worth of money, 2 years worth of highways. Now, we're raising that pension benefit, that pension guarantee, again, by $200 per person. Now, how many companies do you think are going to keep their pension plan? People might not be aware that pensions are voluntary in this country. They're not mandated. They're voluntary. Unfortunately, there are a lot of companies that realize the value of maintaining their employees, and so they have pension plans. And they worry about those pension plans. They want to make sure that they're going to be solvent so they can provide what they need to. They're liable for it. And so it's wrong for us to increase a tax to say that we're going to help make sure that those are more secure. And then the money never goes into the fund that insures it? Let's see, should that come under the category of fraud? So those savings from these rate increases will be spent on federal discretionary programs. And employers are still in the process of implementing a $9 billion rate increase to pay for the highways in last year's transit bill. So to put it simply, over 2 years, the flat rate premium will have increased 40%, and over 3 years, the variable rate premium will have increased over 100%. If you're in business, and you're looking at a 100% increase in your pension costs, you got to take a look at it and say, you know, there's got to be a different way we can go. And that's going to mean that a lot of people are not going to have the pensions. They'll have the pensions that they've been promised to that date, but not the pensions that they were looking forward to at the time that they retire. That is a huge tax that will cause companies to end their voluntary pension and their retirement plans. These pensions are completely voluntary, and if the cost to keep them goes up, companies may have to reevaluate. Workers and their families will be forced to find other ways to save for retirement due to this increased tax on companies. And there isn't anything else you can call it. I noticed that they're trying to call it a fee. Well, the definition on a fee is if you don't participate, then you don't have to pay it. Well, that isn't what we're trying to do. We're trying to have companies provide pensions. We're not trying to have them realize that they can't afford the pensions that they're giving out because of increased charges by the federal government. So that's wrong. And under this budget deal, they're again telling Wyoming, Montana, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and other states that allow for the production of minerals on their land that the federal government deserves more than half the revenues. Under federal law, states are entitled to half the royalties collected by the federal government for energy production on their lands. To distribute the state's share, the law intends for the Minerals Management Service to divide the amount of mineral royalties collected by the two and to write a check for that amount and mail it to the states. But an even split isn't enough under this new budget. In an attempt to satisfy an insatiable appetite for spending, the budget bills plan to take more money away from our states, about $40 million each year. Now, we had an interesting situation this last year when they did the sequester. The federal government said, okay, our half of the money when it comes in is revenue. Your half of the money when it goes out is an expenditure. Therefore, we need to take the 5 3/10% out of that. Well, when we heard that, we started passing a bill around and getting a lot of traction on it from both red and blue states saying, that's wrong. You can't take our money away. If you're going to take something out for a sequester, it at least ought to come out of both halves. But it definitely doesn't deserve to come out of what's by law, money that belongs to the state. We raised enough furor, and it looked like that bill could pass, and I'm sorry that we didn't go ahead and pass it. The federal government decided that they were wrong, and so they've agreed that they're going to pay back that 5 3/10% that they stole from the states. But this budget puts about another $40 million each year in there that the federal government's going to keep out of the state's half. That's money that the states use for roads, for health care, yes, health care, education for children, and more efficient and environmentally friendly development of our energy resources. It's money that finds its way directly to the people, not down some bureaucratic black hole. A disproportionate share of this funding, about $20 million, comes from my home state of Wyoming, which supplies a disproportionate share of energy to this country. Yet the federal government still wants more. Unlike bureaucrats, we have to answer to our constituents. Mine are telling me they don't want the federal government to take any more of our state's money. I'm sure yours will tell you the same thing. Whenever you have some money, they're saying, okay, the states are rich now compared to the federal government, and that's the truth with almost every state. So they're planning on how we can steal the money from the states and give it to the federal government. So worst of all, the so-called Budget Conference Committee, for all practical purposes, did not exist. The agreement was the sole product of one House member and one Senate member. I sat on the conference committee, and I can tell you that I learned the particulars of the deal at the same time as the public. They weren't part of the process or the negotiations, and neither were we. So we did have a meeting to begin with, and everybody got to give statements for how they thought this deal ought to go. There were no further meetings of the conference. Any conference that I've ever been on, once there was a deal made, you met again, and you got an explanation of the deal, and then all the sides voted. And if it didn't receive a positive vote in the Senate and in the House, it wasn't passed on as a conference that was finished yet. You went back to the drawing boards again. Guess we were in a crisis here and decided that we had to do something in a hurry. But that's the worst of all worlds when you do that. When we're not a part of the process of the negotiations, it's not the way this body was designed. Conference committees have a definite purpose. Actually, the task should not have even been assigned to the Budget Committee. The task should have been assigned to the spending committees. We were at the point where in the calendar of business, There are already bills that the appropriations, the spending people have put together for all 12 items. And those could have been brought up one at a time, probably take a week for each of them if amendments were allowed, and we would have wound up with a pretty good budget, pretty good spending. Of course, I'm kind of fascinated. We're about to January, and starting in January, I'll have dozens of people from Wyoming visit me. It's a long trip from Wyoming to come out here, and they'll come out here on individual programs of the federal government. And they will say, please, this is how important this particular program is. Please make sure that we get funding for it. One of them is Head Start. And they actually think that we get to look at the Head Start budget and make additions or subtractions from it. We don't even get to look at Health and Human Services or transportation or any of those. They all get lumped together sometime in the year. There is no oversight. There are no decisions by the main body on how to spend $1 trillion a year. That's the wrong way to do it. So this is a symptom of the abandonment of the committee process. Instead of representatives and senators offering constructive amendments and debating spending bills in public, a couple people and their staff sit in a room and then present a take it or leave it right before a holiday or a manufactured crisis deadline. And we're going to have that yet on the omnibus spending bill. Right now we're just doing a continuing resolution and allowing those agencies to spend 1/12 of what they spent the year before, essentially. So they don't know what they get to do for the rest of the year. And when the sequester hit, it was supposed to be 2 3/10%, but we were 8 months through the year already, so they had to take those cuts out of the last 4 months. The result was they had to take 5 3/10% out. And I mentioned Head Start. They came to me and they said, you know, we can't afford to have 7.5% cut every year. I said, where would 7.5% come from? Well, they said, that's what we're being cut. Well, it looks to me like what happened is the bureaucracy in Washington took their 5 3/10% cut, but stole 2 3/10% from the local folks in order to pay for the Washington bureaucracy. So it was the kids that suffered. The kids didn't get the money. More kids had to be taken off of the roll instead of more kids put on the roll. If it's going to hurt, it ought to hurt in Washington. It shouldn't hurt out there where the kids are. Well, I have some solutions for it. One of them is the no government shutdowns. And the way that would work, if those spending committees don't have their work done by the time they're supposed to, which would be October 1st, each spending committee would have to take 1% off of what they're allowed to spend each quarter until they actually get their work done. I think that'd be a little incentive for them to get their work done. I also have a penny plan. A penny plan would cut 1 cent off every dollar that the federal government spends. That, in conjunction with sequester, would balance our budget in just 2 years. Just 2 years. That'd be 3 3/10% for 2 years. And I think that people would say, you know, that wasn't too bad, provided we didn't make it hurt. That's one of the terrible things about government. They always like to pick the things that people really notice instead of eliminating things like duplication. And there's plenty of duplication out there. There's $900 billion a year in the federal government on duplication. You ought to be able to eliminate half a duplication, shouldn't you? That would be a better deal than the sequester. But we don't do that. We make it hurt. We want people to notice that their item is being cut, and then they complain, and then we restore it, and that's how you get to $17 trillion worth of debt. Everything would be on the table. It would have flexibility so that it didn't have to hurt. It could get rid of that duplication. And then, of course, I'm also proposing a biennial budget. The way that would work is we would appropriate for every agency for a 2-year period. So they know what they were doing for 2 years, so they could actually do some planning, not wait till we're 8 months through the year before we tell them how to spend their money for the last 4 months. Now, I have a little twist in my biennial budgeting. I'd split the 12 spending bills up into 2 categories. And right after an election, we'd do the 6 bills. That year, we'd do the 6 bills that are really tough. And then the next year, we'd do the 6 bills that are really easy. And then we'd actually be able to look at those individual items. And a lot of these things that come up on the floor as extraneous amendments to other bills wouldn't need to be done because they'd be done with the spending part that they're supposed to do. So those are a few plans right there. We do have a spending problem. We don't have a revenue problem. We shouldn't raise taxes in order for Washington to spend more. We can't spend our way to prosperity. That's more people getting in the wagon and less people pulling the wagon. Identifying a process forward for tax reform, that's where part of the efforts of the budget conference should be focused. If done correctly, tax reform will help to generate additional revenue through economic growth. Let me repeat that, not through new taxes, but through economic growth to reduce the deficits and pay down the debt. And I'm ready to make that happen. We need to prioritize spending. Finding the spending cuts that will do the least harm and start there. It's worked in Wyoming. Our governor knew that he might be having an 8% cut in the revenues that the state was going to get. So what did he do? Got a hold of all the agencies and he said, I want to know what you would, what you would cut if you had to cut 2%, what you'd cut if you had to cut 4%, what you'd have to cut if you had to cut 6%, and what you'd have to cut if you had 8%. Now, why did he do that? That gives him 4 lists to look at, and he can see what that agency thinks is the most important to cut. What would be the least hurt to cut? And that's exactly what they did. They wound up having to do a 6% cut, and there wasn't a whimper. We could do that too. I set up nation's debt and how it will affect Wyoming children, my children, grandchildren. There's a chance to apply reasonable constraints to impossibly high future spending, but instead we get more spending and no plan to solve the problem. America wants a plan. There's nothing as universal as that. They tell me every time in Wyoming, you got to quit spending more than you take in. And I agree with them. Congress should be working on federal spending bills and a responsible budget for months. And the Senate majority put that work off. I could go into some things on the defense bill. I've got a lot of things here, and over the next few days I'll be talking about some of these. But what we're going through right now is, instead of these things that I'm talking about that are really important to the American people, that will really make a difference in their lives, we're doing some judges that it doesn't make any difference on. There are plenty of judges out there already. But that's to detract us from these problems of Obamacare and a budget. We've got to solve the real problems and quit worrying about whether the judges can be stacked in the District of Columbia so that the president can have his way. That's wrong. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I'd first like to thank my distinguished colleague, Senior Senator from Wyoming, who is